I'm Lauren Mitchell. I'm 27 years old, and 3 months ago I stood in the middle of the Atlanta airport and watched my family circle around the only man who had ever truly loved us. The departure boards flickered overhead, people hurried past with rolling suitcases, and my grandfather Henry clutched his worn leather bag like a kid about to take his first plane ride. He had just spent $2 million on a luxury trip to Europe, convinced that a shared adventure would finally bring his children and grandchildren back to him. My father was smiling too widely. My mother was already posing for pictures, and my aunt was talking about Paris restaurants she'd read about online. I remember the way Grandpa's hand trembled on the handle of his suitcase, how he kept looking from one face to another, as if he couldn't believe they'd all said yes. I didn't know it then, but before we ever reached the front of that check-in line, one sentence was waiting for us, a sentence that would change everything I thought I knew about my own blood. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to choose between doing what's easy and doing what's right for someone you love. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a big white house that people in town liked to point at when they drove by. To the outside world, the Mitchells were the picture of success. My father Thomas ran around town in tailored suits as if he owned every block. My mother Carol floated through charity events in sequined dresses, and my Aunt Diane always seemed to have a new designer handbag dangling from her arm. People would tell me how lucky I was to be part of that family, to have a last name tied to office buildings and shopping centers. But inside those pretty walls, it never quite felt like the home everyone imagined. My parents' schedules were packed with meetings and galas, and most of my childhood memories of them are of closed doors, glowing phone screens, and conversations that stopped the moment I walked into the room. The constant in my life wasn't my parents at all. It was my grandfather Henry. He was the one who showed up when no one else did. On rainy afternoons when my ride forgot me after school, it was Grandpa's old pickup that pulled up to the curb, his window rolling down with a grin and a thermos of hot cocoa sitting in the cup holder. When I played piano in the school auditorium, I could barely see past the stage lights, but I could always hear him clapping too loud, laughing when I bowed, shouting, "That's my girl," long after the applause had faded. He had made his money in real estate over decades, buying tired old buildings and turning them into something useful again, but he never talked about it like a triumph. To him, a full dining table, a quiet Sunday afternoon with family, or a grandchild's crooked drawing taped to the fridge mattered more than any contract he'd ever signed. What struck me, even as a teenager, was how different he was from the rest of the family. Henry's hands were rough and scarred from years of hands-on work, while my father's were manicured and rarely seen without a phone in them. Grandpa wore the same soft flannel shirts until the elbows thinned, while Aunt Diane was always posting pictures of her latest look for her friends to admire. When Grandpa gave me small gifts, a used book he thought I'd like a silver bracelet for graduating high school, I noticed the way my father's jaw tightened and how my mother's smile slipped for just a second. The message was always clear. His attention toward me wasn't something they appreciated. To them, he was the source, the one who paid for the beach house summers and the new cars in the driveway, and any affection that didn't flow through them seemed to irritate them more than they ever said out loud. At family dinners, the difference between how they treated him and how he treated them was almost painful. Grandpa would sit at the end of the long dining table he'd bought years ago, a mug of black coffee cradled in his hands, listening patiently while everyone else talked over him about business deals, vacations, and which restaurant had the best wine list. Brittany and Josh. My cousins rarely looked up from their phones, their thumbs moving faster than the conversation. Diane would lean over to my mother and complain that Grandpa still hadn't invested in Mark's big opportunity, her voice low, but not low enough that he couldn't hear. My father would roll his eyes whenever Grandpa tried to tell a story from his younger days, cutting him off with a joke or redirecting the conversation back to himself. Through it all, Grandpa stayed quiet, his eyes moving from one face to another with a softness that didn't match the way he was being treated. There was one evening that has stayed with me more than the others long before the trip was ever mentioned. I was sitting with Grandpa on the back porch of his own home, a broad brick place on the edge of Charleston, where the oak trees stretch their branches over the yard like they're trying to hug the whole property. The sun had dropped low, painting the sky in stripes of orange and purple, and the air hummed with crickets. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking, and stared out over the garden he'd planted himself. "You know, Lauren," he said quietly, "when I started all of this, I thought if I worked hard enough, I could build something strong enough to keep this family together." He paused, rubbing his thumb along the rim of his coffee mug. "All I've ever really wanted is for them to love each other the way I love them." I remember wanting to tell him that I loved him enough for all of them, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just reached over and took his hand, and he gave me a tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Looking back, I think that was the night I first felt a knot of worry I couldn't name. The older I got, the more obvious it became that my father and aunt didn't see Henry as a father to cherish in his old age. They saw a balance sheet with a heartbeat. They tolerated his presence because of what it meant for their image and their future, not because they enjoyed his company. He kept hoping that one day something would change, that they would wake up and see him as more than a bank account. I saw what was really there, a widening gap between the man who held the family together and the family that didn't realize what they had. I didn't know exactly what would cause it, but I had a feeling that hope couldn't stretch forever without snapping. So when my father suddenly started calling Grandpa more often, asking about his health, and suggesting that we should all do something together like a real family, I felt that old knot tighten in my chest. The words sounded right, but the timing was strange, and the warmth in his voice didn't quite match the way he'd treated Henry for years. My aunt began dropping by Grandpa's house with store-bought desserts and stories about how she wished they had more quality time before it was too late. My mother started talking about how lovely it would be to travel with everyone, her eyes lingering a little too long on Grandpa's watch, on his rings, on the framed photos of properties he owned. Before I knew it, there were brochures on the kitchen counter for Paris, Rome, and London, talk of first-class tickets and five-star hotels, and posts from my cousins hinting at some grand family adventure overseas. Grandpa's excitement was so genuine, it almost made me forget my unease. He kept his old suitcase in the hallway days before the trip, polishing the latches and laughing about finally seeing places he'd only read about. "Can you picture it, Lauren?" he'd say, eyes brighter than I'd seen in years. All of us together, in another country, making memories. That's how I always imagined it would be. Watching him talk, I wanted to believe that this time, maybe my father and aunt really meant it, that they'd finally heard what he'd been longing for all his life. I tried to push down the feeling that something about it all was rehearsed, that the sudden affection had arrived just a little too late and a little too perfectly timed. On the morning we left for Atlanta, 2 SUVs sat in our driveway trunks, open, stuffed with glossy luggage sets and shopping bags for the trip essentials. My father joked about Italian wine, my mother took photos in front of the house, and my aunt kept reminding everyone not to forget their passports. I watched Grandpa climb carefully into the back seat with his old leather suitcase on his lap, his fingers resting on it as if he needed to feel it under his hands to be sure this was real. The 3-hour drive to the airport was filled with chatter about landmarks and shopping, while Grandpa mostly sat quietly beside me, glancing up at the rearview mirror every time my father laughed. When we finally stepped into the crowded terminal, the air thick with coffee and airplane fuel and overlapping announcements, I hooked my arm through his and guided him toward the check-in line. I had no way of knowing that just a few minutes later we'd reach the front of that line and hear words from my father that would rip the last bit of innocence out of both of us. The line at the check-in counter moved slowly, each shuffle bringing us closer to the moment my grandfather had looked forward to for weeks. The terminal lights glowed bright against the polished floor, and the hum of conversations blended with the rolling wheels of suitcases around us. Grandpa's fingers rested lightly on my arm as we inched forward. He kept glancing at the family standing ahead of us, a soft smile appearing every time Brittany snapped another photo, or my aunt described which boutiques she wanted to visit first. My father stood at the front with our passports tapping them against his palm, as if he were eager to get through security and into the comfort of the first-class lounge. My mother kept brushing invisible lint off her blazer, her eyes darting over the people behind us as if gathering an audience for our family adventure. When the agent finally waved us forward, we stepped to the counter with a sense of relief. My father handed over the stack of passports one by one, his voice cheerful as he made small talk with the employee. He gestured toward the group, saying something about how excited we all were. My mother leaned in to ask a question about seating, and Diane mentioned the hotel in Paris they had chosen. The agent typed quickly the boarding passes, printing out in a neat rhythm that matched the rising energy around us. Then her typing slowed. She frowned at the screen, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. She checked something again, then looked up. "I'm sorry," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I don't see a reservation under the name Henry Mitchell. I thought I had misheard." Grandpa straightened slightly, his hand slipping from my arm. My father stepped forward with a tight smile. "That has to be a system mix-up," he said. "He's part of our group." The agent shook her head gently. "I've checked the full party. There is no booking under that name." My grandfather's brows knit together, the confusion settling across his face like a shadow. My son handled everything he said softly. "Could you look again?" My father sighed, the way he did when someone inconvenienced him at a restaurant or a valet stand. "Dad, it's all right," he said, lowering his voice. "We need to talk." He placed a hand on Grandpa's shoulder, leaning close enough that only a few nearby passengers could hear. "I forgot to book your ticket. You'll have to go home." My breath caught the terminal noise suddenly too loud. Grandpa's lips parted slightly, the color draining from his face. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He simply stood there, his hand trembling on the handle of his old suitcase. My mother stepped in quickly, her voice soft but firm. "Henry, the trip would be too much for you. We'll bring you something nice from Europe." Diane added a sympathetic tilt of her head. "It's better this way." Really. The air around us shifted as if the floor itself had tilted. Brittany glanced at us, rolled her eyes, and focused back on her phone. Josh kept his headphones on, swaying slightly, to whatever music drowned out the moment. A few travelers nearby slowed their steps, not hiding the way they leaned in to listen. I felt my own voice rise before I could stop it. "What are you talking about?" "He paid for everything." My father stiffened, and my mother's expression hardened. "How could you leave him behind?" I said, my voice unsteady, but loud enough to carry. Several people in line turned to watch. Brittany muttered under her breath. "This is so embarrassing," Diane whispered sharply. "Lauren, lower your voice." The agent at the counter looked between us, unsure whether to help or step back. My father straightened, his expression cool. "Enough, Lauren. Don't cause a scene." I stepped closer to Grandpa, placing my arm around his back to steady him. "He's not staying here alone," I said. "If he isn't going, I'm not going either." My father's jaw clenched. "You'll regret that decision. Don't expect us to support you when you come crawling back." My mother avoided my eyes, busying herself with the passports, as if the conversation were happening far away. Diane shook her head as if I were a child ruining a pleasant morning. Mark tugged at his shirt collar, glancing around at the growing audience. Grandpa looked at me, his eyes dimming. "Maybe they're right," he whispered. "Maybe I don't belong." His voice was barely there, carried away by the noise of the terminal. Something in me tightened at the sound of it. I wrapped my arms around him, holding on as the rest of the family gathered their luggage and moved toward security without a single backward glance. The agent cleared her throat gently. "Next, please." My father led the group forward, rolling his suitcase behind him. My mother followed, adjusting her scarf. Diane walked ahead with Brittany and Josh, her voice already lifting with excitement about the champagne she planned to order before boarding. Mark trailed behind his shoulders, hunched, avoiding eye contact. In a matter of seconds, they were swallowed by the crowd. Grandpa and I remained at the counter, his suitcase still upright beside him, untouched. He stared at the boarding gate ahead, as if watching something he had dreamed of drift out of reach. I turned to him, my voice low. "You're not alone," I said. "I'm right here." He gave a small nod, but the sadness in his eyes stayed with me all the way back through the terminal. We stepped outside into the warm Georgia air, the sounds of taxis and luggage carts filling the space between us. As we walked toward the curb, he kept his gaze lowered, each step slower than the last. "I thought this would bring us together," he said quietly when we reached the taxi line. I didn't answer. The driver loaded his suitcase into the trunk, and we settled into the back seat. The ride back to Charleston stretched ahead of us, miles of road and silence waiting to be filled. The evening light faded as we pulled onto the highway, leaving the bustle of the airport behind. Grandpa sat with his hands folded in his lap, the lines on his face deeper than I remembered that morning. Now and then he glanced at his reflection in the window as though trying to recognize the man staring back. Halfway through the drive he spoke. His voice was faint but steady. "I should have known better than to believe they wanted me there." I rested my hand on his arm. "You wanted us to be together. There's nothing wrong with that." He didn't respond. He turned back toward the passing road, the lights from the gas stations and billboards flickering across his features like the remnants of a memory he couldn't quite hold on to. When we reached Charleston and pulled up to his estate, the house stood quiet against the dark sky. The porch lights cast soft circles on the stairs, guiding us to the front door. Inside, the grand foyer echoed with each step we took. The chandelier hung above us, its crystals shimmering, but the air felt heavy. Grandpa set his suitcase down near the staircase, with a careful motion as if its weight had changed. He stood there for a long moment, taking in the home he had built, each detail chosen for a family that no longer needed it. "I built this place so they would always have somewhere to return to," he said as we walked toward his study. His voice was calm, but something in it felt fragile. "Now it feels like I'm the only one left who remembers why I did it." He walked into the study and lowered himself into the leather armchair near the fireplace. The lamp on the side table cast a warm glow across the room. With slow hands, he reached into the drawer and pulled out an old family photograph. His thumb moved over the image, tracing the outline of faces that once meant everything to him. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him in the soft light. The house was quiet now, the air still the only sound, the faint rustle of the photograph between his fingers. He didn't say anything else. I walked over, resting my hand gently on the arm of his chair. He looked up, meeting my eyes with a mixture of exhaustion and something that felt like acceptance. Nothing had been said out loud, but I felt it as clearly as if he had spoken the words. The family he'd spent his life building had turned away. And now something inside him had shifted something I knew I could not ignore. As the grandfather clock in the hallway marked the passing minutes, I understood that this moment, quiet as it was, marked the beginning of a reckoning none of them saw coming. The house stayed quiet long after Grandpa settled into his armchair, and I found myself moving through the hallways with careful steps, as if any sudden noise might unsteady him. The chandelier cast a warm glow across the marble floor, but the light felt distant. The rooms that had once been filled with voices now carried only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional sigh of the old wooden beams. When I reached the kitchen, I let my hand rest on the counter, the cool surface grounding me as I thought about how quickly the morning had unraveled. I made tea and carried a cup to the study, placing it on the table beside Grandpa. He didn't look up at first. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph in his hands, his thumb drifting across it in slow, measured strokes. I sat on the edge of the nearby chair, letting the silence circle the room without pushing for conversation. When he finally glanced at the cup, he gave a faint nod, one that told me he appreciated the gesture, even if he couldn't find the words. He didn't drink it. A few minutes later, he folded the photograph carefully and set it back into the drawer, closing it with a soft click. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice steady but thin. "It's been a long day." I didn't argue. I told him I would be upstairs if he needed anything, then left him with the warm lamplight and the quiet that filled the room. Climbing the staircase, I paused halfway, glancing back toward the study. His silhouette was still visible through the doorway, his shoulders angled slightly forward, as if the weight of the day had finally settled there. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to settle my own thoughts. I could still hear the agent's voice at the airport, still see my father turning away without hesitation. Every moment replayed in my mind, and each time the feeling that filled me wasn't anger so much as disbelief. The house creaked gently as the night deepened, each small sound reminding me that Grandpa was downstairs alone. When morning light seeped through my curtains, I got up quickly and headed downstairs. The smell of coffee reached me before I entered the kitchen, and I found Grandpa by the counter pouring himself a cup. He looked tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. His shoulders were a little slumped, and the lines around his eyes seemed deeper, but when he noticed me, he straightened and offered a faint smile. "I thought I'd try to get an early start," he said quietly. He took a sip of the coffee and stared out the window toward the garden. I joined him, leaning against the counter beside him. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The morning sun lit the yard, highlighting the azaleas he had planted himself, neat rows of color scattered across the lawn. Even with the brightness outside, the kitchen felt dim. After breakfast, he wandered the house with slow steps, pausing at the framed photos that lined the hallway. Some were old, showing birthdays and long-ago vacations where everyone smiled naturally. Others were more recent, polished, and posed for holiday cards. He looked at each one with a quiet focus, his expression unreadable. Later, I found him in the garden watering the plants with steady, practiced motions. The hose made small arcs of water across the flowers, and the morning breeze carried the scent of wet soil. I walked toward him, but he didn't notice at first, too caught up in the task. When he finally glanced my way, he nodded in greeting and kept working. He spent the rest of the morning dusting picture frames in the hallway and polishing the banister of the staircase. He moved slowly but with care, as though tending to the house might quiet the memories crowding his mind. I followed him at a distance, sweeping the living room and straightening cushions, trying not to intrude, but wanting him to know he wasn't alone. That afternoon, we sat in the sunroom with glasses of water. Light filtered through the tall windows, scattering across the floor in shifting shapes. Grandpa studied the patterns, his fingers tapping lightly against the arm of his chair. "I thought they'd appreciate the chance to be together," he said softly, not looking at me. "I thought maybe this time it would work." His voice drifted off, and the quiet around us grew thicker. I didn't know how to respond without stepping into territory he wasn't ready for yet, so I waited. After a moment, he took a slow breath. "I don't know how to understand it," he said. His hand rested on his knee, trembling slightly. "I keep trying to see it from their side, but I can't." He turned toward me, his eyes calm, but weighed down. "I don't want to hold on to resentment," he said. "But today, everything feels different." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a kind of weary confusion. He looked back toward the windows, the sunlight reflecting gently in his eyes. The world outside continued in its usual rhythm, the wind stirring the branches of the magnolia tree, a bird calling from somewhere near the fence line. As the day stretched on, he moved through the house again, not with purpose, but to stay busy. He sorted through old letters, arranged books on the shelves, and paused often to steady himself. I stayed nearby preparing lunch and keeping watch without making it obvious. Later that evening, I found him in the dining room sitting alone at the long table. The room was dim, the only light coming from the fixture above him. He held a folded napkin in his hands, turning it slowly, as if trying to occupy his thoughts. I sat down across from him. "Can I get you anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, thank you." His gaze drifted toward the empty chairs around the table. For years, those chairs had been filled with conversation, laughter, and plans for holidays. Now they sat untouched, the space between them stretching wider than the table itself. "I suppose I should have seen this coming," he said after a moment, "but I kept hoping it would be different." He didn't say it with frustration or sorrow. It was simply an acknowledgement, quiet and steady. I nodded gently. "It's been a long day," I said. He gave a small smile, the first I had seen since morning. "Yes, it has." We sat for a while without speaking, letting the soft hum of the air vents and the faint clatter from the kitchen fill the space. Eventually he stood up slowly, his hand resting on the table for support. "I think I'll turn in," he said. "Tomorrow will be better." I watched him walk down the hallway toward his room, the dim light casting a long shadow behind him. When he disappeared around the corner, I remained seated for a moment, my hands resting on the table where so many family meals had taken place. Upstairs, the house settled around me as I prepared for bed. The floors creaked softly, and the wind brushed against the windows, carrying the faint smell of night-blooming jasmine from the garden. As I pulled the blanket over myself, I could still picture him sitting alone at the table, the room too large for one person. It was clear that the hurt had reached deeper than either of us expected. Something in him had shifted not just from disappointment, but from the quiet realization that the past couldn't be repaired simply by wishing it. The night settled gently over the house. When sleep finally came, it carried the unmistakable sense that the next morning would bring a choice, one that neither of us could avoid much longer. Morning sunlight reached through the curtains when I woke, catching the edges of the room in a warm glow that didn't match the heaviness in my chest. The house was quiet again, too quiet for a place built to hold a large family. I made my way downstairs, following the faint clatter coming from the dining room. Grandpa was there with a newspaper folded beside his plate, stirring a cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. He looked up when I stepped in, offering a soft smile that didn't quite erase the strain around his eyes. "I thought you'd sleep a little longer," he said, his voice steady. I sat across from him. "Didn't want to," I replied gently. He nodded and set the spoon aside. The smell of toast lingered in the air, but it didn't look like he had eaten much. He folded the newspaper and pushed it away, as though the day ahead required more space than the table allowed. After breakfast, he stood and walked toward his study. I followed, unsure if he wanted company, but unwilling to leave him alone. The door swung open quietly, revealing papers scattered across the desk, old insurance documents, property deeds, and a few folders that had once been neatly stacked. He paused at the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame. "I was looking for something earlier," he said. "Thought I'd go through the accounts, make sure everything's in order." He moved slowly to the desk, taking a seat with the weight of someone trying to navigate familiar ground that suddenly felt unfamiliar. I joined him, pulling out a chair on the opposite side. For a moment he sat without touching anything, only staring at the folder on top. When he finally opened it, the first page was a wire transfer confirmation with his name at the top. He scanned it with a steady gaze, but the corners of the page trembled slightly between his fingers. His breath left him in a quiet exhale. "This was everything they asked for," he said. "Everything they said we needed for the trip." I nodded, waiting. He lowered the paper and reached for another document. Inside the folder marked travel itinerary, he searched for something he couldn't seem to name aloud. After a moment, he stopped flipping through the pages and set them aside. "Lauren," he said softly, "would you mind checking something for me?" I moved to his side, leaning close enough to see the details on each page. Among hotel reservations and flight confirmations, there was no record of his name. His eyes followed my movements, as though bracing himself for an answer he already knew. "It wasn't an accident," I said quietly. He closed the folder and rested his hands on it. "I thought maybe I misunderstood." His gaze drifted to the window. "But it seems I was the only one who believed this trip meant something more." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger. The absence of both filled the room with a deeper ache than anything he could have expressed aloud. Later in the afternoon, he settled into the living room while I made calls from the kitchen, trying to confirm every detail we had found. When I reached the travel agency in Charleston, I explained what I needed, and the manager, Megan Lewis, agreed to speak in person. She remembered my family and recognized the name immediately. Her voice carried a mixture of professionalism and concern. "Come by," she said. "I can show you what we have. I told Grandpa where I planned to go." He looked uncertain but nodded as I grabbed my keys. "Be safe," he said, giving me a small smile. The drive downtown took about 20 minutes. Megan greeted me inside the agency, leading me behind the counter with a sympathetic expression. She pulled up the records on her computer and turned the screen slightly toward me. Each reservation was listed clearly. Each seat assignment, each hotel, each traveler. Except one. His name wasn't there. He paid for everything, Megan said, her tone careful. He handled the wire transfer himself. But someone later adjusted the final booking before confirmation. It wasn't a system error. She printed the documentation without hesitation and placed it in a neat folder. "If you need a statement, I can provide one," she said. I thanked her and left with the papers clutched tightly in my hand. The weight of them felt heavier than they should have, carrying all the proof I needed, but none of the comfort I hoped for. When I returned home, the sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn. Grandpa was in the dining room again, sitting upright with his hands folded together. He looked up when I entered, noticing the folder in my hands. "What did you find?" he asked quietly. I sat beside him and opened the folder. "They never intended to take you," I said. "Your name was removed before the trip was finalized." He took the paper, slowly studying each page until the truth of it settled in. His shoulders sagged slightly, but his face remained composed. He set the papers down and leaned back in his chair, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. "Thomas," he said softly, almost to himself. "My own son." The room stayed still, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. After a moment, he turned to me. "What should I do?" he asked. I placed my hand on the table near his. "There's a resource called Adult Protective Services," I said. "They help with situations like this." He looked surprised at first, then thoughtful. "I don't want to make this worse," he said. "They're still my family." I nodded gently. "They shouldn't have put you through this." He was quiet for a long moment. His gaze drifted to the window again, following the faint movement of the trees outside. There was no bitterness in his eyes, only a deep, steady sadness. "If you believe this is the right thing," he said finally, "then I trust you." I gave him a small nod and reached for my phone. When I dialed, a calm voice answered on the second ring. "Adult Protective Services," the man said. "This is Alex. How can I help you?" I stepped into the hallway, speaking quietly as I explained the situation from beginning to end. Alex listened carefully, asking questions when needed, guiding me through each detail. When I mentioned the wire transfer and the travel agency's confirmation, he paused. "You have solid documentation," he said. "This is absolutely something we can look into." He asked if we could come in for an initial meeting. I agreed immediately. When I hung up the phone, I leaned against the wall for a moment, feeling the weight of the conversation settle inside me. I returned to the dining room, where Grandpa sat in the same position, his hands still resting on the papers. When he met my eyes, there was something new there, an acceptance of what had happened, and a quiet resolve beginning to take shape. "We'll go tomorrow," I said. He nodded once, a slow and steady movement. The rest of the evening passed quietly. He spent time in the sunroom, watching the light fade across the yard while I put away the folders and documents in a safe place. The house felt different, not only because of what we had uncovered, but because of the decision we were now stepping into. Before heading upstairs that night, I paused at the doorway to the sunroom. He was seated in his favorite chair, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze steady on the horizon. When he noticed me, he gave a small smile. "Thank you," he said. I nodded. "We'll get through this." He looked back at the yard, the light from the hallway falling softly across his shoulder. Something in the room felt still, almost suspended, as though the next step we took would change the shape of everything that came after. When I finally turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, the house settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm. But beneath that quiet, there was something new, a sense that the days ahead would not be like the days behind us, and that the choice we had made would soon take us somewhere none of us could turn away from. The next morning came quietly, as if the house understood what we were about to do. Grandpa was already awake when I entered the kitchen, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. The way he held it, both palms wrapped around the mug, suggested he needed something steady to hold on to. When he looked up, his expression was calm, but the faint lines on his forehead gave away the weight he was carrying. "Are you ready?" I asked gently. He nodded. "As ready as I can be." We didn't talk much after that. We finished our breakfast in silence, cleaned up the dishes, and gathered the folder of documents we had prepared the night before. When we stepped outside, the early light touched the edges of the trees, casting long shadows across the driveway. The quiet morning seemed to follow us down the road as we drove toward the Adult Protective Services office. The APS building sat on a quiet street just outside of downtown Charleston. The parking lot held only a few cars, and the landscaping was neatly trimmed. When we stepped inside, the lobby felt calm and orderly, with soft lighting and a few chairs arranged near the front desk. A receptionist greeted us and asked us to wait in the seating area. Grandpa lowered himself into one of the chairs, placing the folder carefully on his lap. After a few minutes, a tall man in a navy shirt stepped into the lobby. He had neatly kept hair, a trimmed beard, and a badge clipped to his belt. "Mr. Mitchell?" he asked, offering a warm smile. "I'm Alex Porter. It's good to meet you both." Grandpa stood and they shook hands. I rose as well, and Alex nodded politely before guiding us down a short hallway toward his office. The room was modest with a desk, 2 chairs, and a small bookshelf filled with binders. Sunlight filtered through the window, catching the dust in the air. Once we were seated, Alex folded his hands in front of him. "I appreciate you coming in," he said. "These matters can be difficult, but you're not alone in this." He glanced at the folder on Grandpa's lap. "I understand you brought documentation." I passed it to him. He opened it carefully, going through each page with focused attention. He didn't rush, and he didn't speak until he had seen everything. When he finally closed the folder, he let out a slow breath. "This is substantial," he said. "A wire transfer of this size, followed by exclusion from the trip and the events at the airport taken together, this is enough for us to open a formal investigation." Grandpa looked down at his hands. "I never imagined something like this would involve my family," he said quietly. Alex nodded with understanding. "That's more common than you think. What matters is protecting your well-being. We'll proceed carefully and respectfully." He asked Grandpa a series of questions. Had he been pressured into transferring the funds? Did he feel unsafe? Had anything like this happened before? Grandpa answered with steady honesty, searching for the right words when the questions touched deeper wounds. I listened beside him, feeling each pause echo through the room. When the questions were finished, Alex explained the next steps: interviews, documentation review, and coordination with legal channels if needed. "We'll notify the involved parties once the process is underway," he said, "before they return home if possible." Grandpa nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. When we left the building, the breeze carried a hint of warm air from the nearby marshes. Grandpa paused beside the car and took a long breath as though adjusting to the idea of what we had just set in motion. "I never thought I'd be here," he said softly. "You're not alone," I said. "We'll take this one step at a time." He gave a small nod and opened the car door. The following days unfolded with a stillness that seemed to settle over the entire house. Grandpa spent most of his time tending to the garden or sitting in the sunroom with a book open on his lap. He didn't read much, but the familiar weight of it seemed to bring some comfort. I checked in with Alex regularly, sending any additional documents he requested and updating him on Grandpa's condition. Each time he replied, his messages were steady and reassuring. About a week after our meeting, I found Grandpa in the living room polishing the frame of a family photo. The picture was taken years earlier at Thanksgiving, everyone gathered around the dining table smiling for the camera. Grandpa studied it for a long moment before setting it aside. "Do you think they realize what they've done?" he asked quietly. I hesitated. "I'm not sure," I said, "but Alex will handle everything." He didn't respond, but he gave a small nod and returned to arranging the books on the shelf. His movements were slow, almost measured, as though each task helped pass the time while we waited. 2 more weeks passed. The days blended together, filled with small routines that brought a sense of calm to the house. We cooked dinners together, worked alongside one another in the garden, and sat in the living room to watch the news in the evening. Yet beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of anticipation, the sense that an unseen clock was counting down. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the upstairs hallway, I heard Grandpa on the phone downstairs. His voice carried softly through the house, and I recognized the calm, professional tone of Alex on the other end. When Grandpa hung up, he walked to the base of the stairs and called my name. "Lauren," he said, "Alex wants to speak with you." I hurried down and took the phone from him. "Hello," I said. "Hi, Lauren. It's Alex. I wanted to update you both. Your family is scheduled to fly into Atlanta tomorrow evening. I'll be there to serve the summons personally." My grip tightened on the phone. "You'll handle it?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "I'll meet you both at the arrivals gate. It's important that Mr. Mitchell feels supported." I thanked him, and when I hung up, Grandpa watched my expression carefully. "They're coming home," I said. He nodded slowly. It had to happen eventually. That night, we ate dinner at the small table in the kitchen instead of the dining room. The soft hum of the dishwasher filled the silence between us. Grandpa pushed his food around his plate more than he ate, staring out the window at the dark yard. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a quiet resolve. "Whatever happens," he said, "I'm grateful you stood with me." His voice was steady, and there was something in it that felt like a doorway, opening an understanding that the days ahead would bring change no matter how things unfolded. I reached across the table and rested my hand on his. "We'll get through it," I said. He held my gaze for a moment, then gave a slow nod. The kitchen light cast a soft glow over the room, and for the first time in weeks, I sensed a shift, not in what had happened, but in how he stood inside it. Later, as we turned off the lights and headed to our rooms, the house held a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of hurt or confusion anymore. It was the stillness that comes before a long-awaited step, one that neither of us could delay. When I lay down that night listening to the soft rustle of the trees outside, I knew the next day would open a chapter none of us had faced before. The kind of moment that doesn't erase the past, but brings it into the light where it can no longer be ignored. We reached Atlanta just as the sky began shifting from blue to the orange glow of early evening. The arrival terminal buzzed with the sound of rolling luggage and families greeting one another after long flights. Grandpa walked beside me, his steps steady but slower than usual. His hand brushed against mine now and then, not holding on exactly but staying close. Alex had texted us earlier to confirm where he'd be waiting, and when we stepped inside the terminal, I spotted him standing near the gate, holding a folder tucked beneath his arm. He came toward us with a calm expression. "Thank you both for being here," he said. "They should be landing any minute." We joined him by the railing that overlooked the escalators leading from the international arrivals area. The stream of travelers moved steadily, each one carrying bags or suitcases covered with stickers from different countries. Some walked quickly toward loved ones. Others paused to stretch after the long flight. Grandpa kept his eyes on the moving crowd, his face composed but tense. After a few minutes, the familiar voices of my family drifted upward from the escalator. My father appeared first, stepping off with a confident stride, a pair of sunglasses hooked onto his shirt collar. My mother followed, smoothing her hair with a distracted hand. Diane trailed behind them, carrying shopping bags filled with items from European stores, while Brittany and Josh walked alongside her, their faces bright with chatter about something they had seen overseas. The moment they noticed us, their steps slowed. My father's expression shifted from relaxed to guarded, and he stopped a few feet away. "What are you doing here?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Before I could respond, Alex stepped forward and introduced himself. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell. Mrs. Brooks." "Mr. Brooks," he said, nodding to each of them. "I'm here on behalf of Adult Protective Services. I need to speak with you regarding a formal summons." My mother blinked rapidly. "A summons," she repeated. For what, Alex opened the folder and handed each of them an envelope. "You're being notified of an investigation into allegations of financial abuse concerning Mr. Henry Mitchell." My father's face darkened. "This is a mistake," he said sharply, turning toward Grandpa. "Dad, tell him this isn't true." Grandpa met his eyes. There was no anger in his expression, no raised voice, only steady resolve. "I trusted you," he said quietly, "and I believed the trip was something we would share. But you left me behind." My mother took a step forward. "Henry, you know the trip would have been too hard on you," she said. "We were thinking of your comfort." Alex remained calm. "This conversation will be continued in the proper setting. For now, you've been served. The date and details are included in your documents." Brittany exhaled loudly. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, clutching her shopping bags. Diane folded her arms. "You've created a scene," she said to me, her voice tight. "We just got off a 10-hour flight." I took a small step forward, keeping my voice steady. "Grandpa deserved better." My father stared at me with disbelief. "You don't turn against your family," he snapped. "You don't bring outsiders into private matters." I met his gaze. "I didn't turn against anyone. I stood with the one person who's always stood with me." He opened his mouth to respond, but Alex gently intervened. "You may wish to take some time to review the documents. The court will expect your presence on the scheduled date." The tension in the air thickened as my family exchanged glances. My mother looked around at the people who had paused to watch her face paling as she took in the curious eyes. My father finally lowered his gaze and rolled the summons in his hand, his jaw tightening. "We'll handle this," he said curtly, "but this is far from over." Without waiting for a reply, he motioned for everyone to follow him. They gathered their suitcases and walked away, their footsteps echoing against the polished airport floor. None of them looked back. When the last of them disappeared into the crowd, I felt Grandpa shift slightly beside me. His shoulders eased, and he drew in a long breath. Alex placed a hand lightly on his arm. "You did the right thing coming forward," he said. "We'll see this through." Grandpa nodded. "Thank you," he said softly. We walked with Alex toward the exit, the bustle of the terminal fading behind us. Outside, the warm evening air carried a sense of finality, as though a long chapter had just closed. When we reached the car, Grandpa paused before getting in. He looked back at the terminal, his eyes reflecting a quiet mix of exhaustion and relief. "I never wanted it to come to this," he said. "But I couldn't pretend anymore. I opened the door for him. We'll face whatever comes next together." The drive back to Charleston was quiet. The fading daylight painted the highway in soft colors, and the hum of the engine filled the silence. As the miles passed, Grandpa leaned his head against the window, watching the landscape shift from city lights to open fields. There was no tension in his posture now, only a kind of settled calm. When we reached the estate, the porch lights glowed softly, casting familiar shadows across the steps. Grandpa slowly climbed out of the car, pausing to take in the sight of the house he had built years ago. The moment felt different from the one after the airport weeks earlier. Then the house had felt heavy with disappointment. Tonight it felt like a place waiting for something new. Inside, I set the folder of documents on the entry table, while Grandpa hung his hat on the hook by the door. He walked into the living room and eased himself into his favorite chair near the window. The night air was cool, drifting in from the slightly opened curtains. "I didn't think I'd ever speak those words aloud," he said after a moment. "But when I saw them today, it felt like something I had carried for far too long." I settled onto the couch across from him. "It wasn't easy," I said. He took a deep breath. "No," he agreed, "but necessary." The room fell into a comfortable silence. The soft ticking of the clock above the fireplace filled the space, grounding us in the quiet that followed such a heavy day. Grandpa rested his hands on the arms of the chair, his posture more relaxed than it had been in weeks. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a steady certainty. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, we've already taken the hardest step." I nodded. "Tomorrow we'll prepare. One step at a time." He gave me a small, grateful smile. The house settled around us, the kind of calm that follows a long-awaited truth. And as the night deepened, I sensed that the next thing we faced would bring its own kind of reckoning, one that would no longer be hidden behind airport crowds or quiet hallways, but laid out plainly for the world to see. The courthouse in Charleston settled into a steady hum as Grandpa and I stepped through the glass doors early that morning. The building wasn't large, but its tall windows and polished floors made every sound echo. Grandpa walked beside me with his shoulders squared, dressed in a gray suit he hadn't worn in years. The way he adjusted his tie told me he had spent the morning gathering more than just his belongings. When we reached the check-in desk, the clerk pointed us toward the family division on the second floor. The air grew quieter as we climbed the staircase, and by the time we reached the hallway, most of the noise from the entrance had faded away. Inside the courtroom, the wooden benches reflected the overhead lights in soft, muted tones. Alex greeted us with a nod, his briefcase open on the plaintiff's table. He reached out to steady Grandpa's arm as he sat, then offered a reassuring smile. "This won't be easy," he said gently, "but you're not facing it alone." Across the aisle, my father and mother sat stiffly beside Diane and Mark. Their attorney, a man in a dark gray suit with rimmed glasses, leaned toward them in conversation. Brittany tapped her phone screen repeatedly, while Josh sat hunched over his gaze fixed on a spot near the floor. None of them looked in our direction. The bailiff announced the judge's entrance, and everyone rose as Judge Eleanor Price stepped to the bench. She carried an air of quiet authority, her expression measured as she surveyed the room. When she took her seat, we all followed. Alex began by presenting the case. He walked through the wire transfer, the travel documents, and the events at the airport, laying each detail before the judge with calm precision. When he displayed the printed itinerary with Grandpa's name, absent the silence in the courtroom deepened. This was not an oversight, he said. It was a deliberate act that resulted in emotional and financial harm to Mr. Mitchell. The opposing attorney rose quickly. "Your Honor." He said this is a family matter, an unfortunate misunderstanding. My clients acted out of concern for Mr. Mitchell's health. They believed he wasn't fit to travel. Judge Price leaned forward slightly. Concern does not explain the transfer of $2 million to personal accounts, she said. Continue. Alex called me to the stand first. The bailiff held out the small Bible, and after I swore in, I took my seat, my hands folded in my lap. The courtroom waited, every eye fixed on me. Miss Mitchell. Alex said, "Please describe what took place at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport." I took a breath. "We checked in as a group," I said. "Everyone received a boarding pass except my grandfather. The agent couldn't find his reservation. When she told us his name wasn't listed, my father told him, 'You'll have to go home.' My father shifted in his seat but said nothing. He had packed, he had paid, he was ready to go. I continued. He was excited. And when they left him behind, he didn't argue, he just accepted it." The opposing attorney stood. "You're interpreting events based on emotion," he said. "Isn't it true that your grandfather has had health concerns in recent years?" I kept my voice steady. "He has regular checkups," I said. "He still works in the garden, drives, cooks, and keeps his own home. Health was not the reason he was left behind." Alex thanked me and called Megan Lewis next. She approached the stand with confidence and explained her role at the travel agency. She confirmed the booking details and noted that someone requested an adjustment, removing Grandpa's name shortly before the trip. As she spoke, Diane lowered her head while my mother drew in a slow breath and stared at the floor. When Megan stepped down, an airport staff member testified, recalling overhearing my father tell Grandpa to return home. She wore her uniform, her tone calm and factual without embellishment. With each statement, the room grew heavier. Finally, Alex called Grandpa to the stand. He moved carefully, gripping the railing as he approached. When he sat, he folded his hands together, and for a moment he simply looked at the judge, gathering his thoughts. "Mr. Mitchell," Alex said gently, "why did you agree to fund this trip?" Grandpa spoke softly, but his voice carried through the room. "I wanted us to be a family again," he said. "I thought, if we traveled together, maybe we'd remember what that felt like." Alex nodded. "And did you believe you would be included in the trip?" "Yes," Grandpa said. "I packed. I waited at the airport with everyone. I had my suitcase ready." He paused. "When they told me I wasn't going, I felt, I suppose the only word is forgotten." Across the aisle, my father shifted uncomfortably, but Grandpa didn't look his way. "You loved them enough to give them everything," Alex said. "Why come forward now?" Grandpa clasped his hands a little tighter. "Because what happened at that airport, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. And I don't want to live out my years pretending that didn't matter." When he stepped down, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. The opposing attorney rose once more. "Your Honor, this family has always taken care of Mr. Mitchell," he insisted. "There was no malicious intent. The funds were provided freely." Judge Price raised her hand, signaling for him to stop. She looked from one side of the room to the other, studying each of us in turn. "I have reviewed the documents and listened to the testimony," she said. "Elder financial abuse is a serious matter, particularly when trust has been violated within a family." She picked up her pen, her voice firm and clear. "I find sufficient evidence that Mr. Henry Mitchell was exploited." A quiet gasp rippled through the room. "Therefore," she continued, "I am ordering that the $2 million be repaid in full. Additionally, Mr. Mitchell's children and in-laws are removed from all inheritance and guardianship rights effective immediately." My father stood abruptly. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice strained. Judge Price fixed him with a steady gaze. "What's outrageous? Mr. Mitchell is abandoning your father at an airport after accepting his money under false pretenses." My mother covered her mouth while Diane pressed her palm to her forehead. Mark muttered something under his breath, but the judge continued without pause. "This ruling is final. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck sharp and final. As the courtroom emptied, Alex gathered his papers and walked to us. "You were brave today," he told Grandpa. "Both of you." Grandpa nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you." When we stepped into the hallway, the sunlight pouring through the windows felt almost bright enough to warm the cool tile beneath our feet. Grandpa reached for my hand, and I laced my fingers through his, steadying him as we walked toward the doors. Outside, the breeze lifted gently along the sidewalk, carrying away the stale air of the courtroom. Grandpa paused at the steps, looking across the street toward the historic district where the trees swayed lightly in the afternoon light. "It's over," he said quietly. I squeezed his hand. "They can't hurt you anymore." He gave a small nod, and in that moment his shoulders eased as though a weight he had carried for years had finally slipped free. But there was something else there, too, something like possibility. As we walked to the car, the sound of distant traffic mixed with the rustle of leaves overhead. The day felt strangely peaceful for everything we had faced, and as I opened the passenger door for Grandpa, I sensed that whatever came next would lead us somewhere steady and new, something built not on what we lost, but on what we had chosen to protect. The ride home from the courthouse felt quieter than the trip that morning, but the stillness wasn't heavy the way it had been before. Grandpa sat beside me with his hands resting calmly in his lap, his gaze drifting across the passing streets as though he were seeing them with new eyes. When we pulled into the driveway, the soft glow from the porch lights cast a gentle welcome across the steps. He opened the car door slowly, taking a moment to breathe in the evening air before walking up to the house. Inside, the familiar scent of wood polish and old books seemed warmer somehow. Grandpa paused in the foyer and let his hand rest on the banister, as though grounding himself after a long journey. "It feels different today," he said quietly. I nodded. "It does." We moved into the living room, where he eased into his favorite chair by the window. The night breeze brushed through the curtains, carrying the faint sound of crickets from the garden. I sat across from him, giving him space to settle into the moment. "I thought the courtroom would leave me feeling broken," he said after a pause. "But instead I feel steady." The word hung gently in the room. He folded his hands, his fingers relaxed rather than clenched. "For the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm standing alone." He looked at me with a soft smile. "Thank you for staying when it would have been easier to walk away." I leaned back, letting his words settle between us. "You've stood by me my whole life," I said. This was my turn. He nodded with a quiet understanding that didn't need more words. Over the next few days, the house eased back into its natural rhythm. Grandpa spent more time in the garden, tending to the flowers, with slow, purposeful movements. I often found him pausing to breathe in the scent of the blooms or brushing soil from his hands with a peaceful patience I hadn't seen in months. Inside, the rooms felt lighter, as if they were finally holding a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. One morning while I brewed coffee in the kitchen, Grandpa walked in carrying a thin folder. He set it on the table and pulled out a sheet of paper. "I've been thinking," he said. "I want to put that money to good use, something that means something." He slid the paper across to me. At the top was a simple title, "The Henry Mitchell Foundation for Elder Support and Advocacy." Underneath, in neat handwriting, he had outlined his first ideas, a small fund to help seniors facing financial abuse grants, to community centers and workshops on recognizing warning signs. "I don't want what happened to me to be the end of the story," he said. "I want it to be the beginning of something that helps others." I traced the title with my eyes, feeling a quiet warmth settle in my chest. "It's perfect," I said. We spent the next week shaping the foundation meeting with advisors and organizing the first steps. When we visited a local community center to introduce the project, Grandpa shook hands with the staff and shared his story in simple, steady words. The people around him listened with compassion, and when he finished, they welcomed the idea with open arms. I watched the way his face brightened during those conversations, not with pride, but with a sense of purpose returning to him. Later that evening, we sat together on the back porch as the sun dipped behind the trees. The light stretched across the sky in soft bands of pink and gold, casting a warm glow over the garden. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, a relaxed expression settling across his features. "I never wanted to lose my family," he said. "But sometimes life gives you a different kind of family than the one you imagined." He didn't say it with bitterness. It sounded more like acceptance, gentle, measured, and honest. I reached for his hand. "You still have a family," I said. "Right here." He squeezed my fingers lightly, his gaze moving over the quiet yard. The house behind us felt safe, not because of its walls or its size, but because of the peace we'd found inside it. A few days later, as we finalized the foundation's paperwork, he looked up from the documents with a thoughtful expression. "I spent so much time hoping they would change," he said, "but today I realize the most important change happened here." He tapped his chest gently. "I've learned to let go." There was no trace of anger in his voice, only a calm certainty that spoke of healing. In the weeks that followed, the house filled with new voices, volunteers, advisors, neighbors who wanted to help with the foundation. The energy was warm and steady, building slowly like a tide rising along the shore. Grandpa greeted every visitor with the same gentle smile, and each evening we ended the day with a quiet moment on the porch, watching the sun settle behind the magnolia trees. One night as the sky faded into twilight, Grandpa turned to me and said, "You showed me what love looks like when everything else falls away. I hope you carry that with you." I nodded, feeling the weight and the comfort of his words. "I will." He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment as the breeze moved through the branches. The peace in his expression told me that the journey we had taken, every painful step, every hard truth, had led us somewhere worth reaching. And as I sat beside him with the soft hum of evening settling around us, I felt a lesson take shape in my own heart. Justice doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like choosing dignity when others have forgotten theirs. Sometimes it means standing by someone until they remember their own strength. Thank you for listening to our story. If it stayed with you in any way, feel free to share it or reach out in the comments. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight.